She was supposed to arrive in Perm that morning. An 18-year-old girl, freshly graduated from school, a first-year student at the pedagogical college, heading back to her dorm after a quiet weekend with her parents in a small village. Her name was Valentina Shklyeva. She got up before dawn, packed her things, said goodbye to her parents, and walked to the train that connected their village to the big city. It was September 30th, 2002, around 5:30 a.m. when she boarded train number 06862, Balezino, Perm 2. For her parents, this was a routine trip. Their daughter had already done it before. Home on the weekend, back to the city on Monday. They imagined her sitting by the window, maybe sleepy, maybe reading or thinking about classes. What they did not know was that this time, in one of the carriages, there was a man they knew by face and name, a man from their own village, Cheptsa. His name was Sergey Baltabayevich Khalmetov. On paper, he was just a rail worker, a husband, a father, someone people greeted on the street without fear. On that train, he and Valentina talked for hours as the carriages rolled toward Perm. For her, it might have felt like a harmless conversation with a familiar man from home. For him, it was the beginning of something much darker, a pattern that would unfold over the next years, approaching, gaining trust, isolating, and then killing. Long before he sat in that carriage with Valentina, Sergey Baltabayevich Khalmetov had grown up in the quiet rural landscape of Kesky district in the Udmurt ASSR. Born in 1978, he came of age in a region where life was simple and hard at the same time. Small settlements, manual labor, and a future that often looked like more of the same. Very little is known about his childhood. No detailed testimonies, no documented pattern of early violence or abuse. Officially, his early years are described only as very little is known. After finishing school, he followed a path that looked respectable from the outside. He got married. Together with his wife and their child, he moved to the village of Cheptsa. There he took a job as a trackman on the railroad, working with rails and infrastructure that kept trains moving across the region. Friends, neighbors, and relatives later described him positively. A calm man, a worker, someone you could rely on. There were no dramatic warnings or obvious red flags that would have made him stand out to the community. No reputation as a thug, no open hostility. He blended into the background of provincial life. That was his greatest advantage as a predator. He looked like a man who could be trusted enough to sit with your daughter on a train and chat for hours while the countryside slid by outside the window. For Valentina, the move to Perm had been a big step. After finishing school in Cheptsa, she had successfully enrolled at the Perm Pedagogical College, moved into a local hostel, and started building a future as a student. She was at the age where life feels like it is finally opening up. New friends, a new city, new opportunities. At the end of September 2002, she decided to spend a weekend at home with her parents. She traveled back, stayed a few days, and on the morning of September 30th, she prepared to return to Perm. That early morning, she walked to the train, probably carrying a small bag with clothes, study materials, and things for the dorm. At around 5:30 a.m., she boarded train number 0662, Balezino, Perm 2. Somewhere in the carriage, she encountered Sergey Khalmetov. They were fellow villagers. They knew each other by sight, by name, by shared environment. Witnesses later said they saw them talking together on that train. They spoke for several hours during the trip as the train moved through the gray light of early morning across stations, forests, and industrial outskirts. Later, when he was already an accused killer, Khalmetov would describe what happened after the train reached the city. He claimed that he got off the train in Perm together with Valentina. According to his version, he offered her to drink beer, and she agreed. Together they left at the Kuria railway station, stepped off the platform, and walked toward a nearby forest. He would say that they sat there, talked, drank, and then the situation changed. He said he proposed having sex and started touching her. When she resisted, his story turned into violence. He described how he beat her, raped her, and strangled her to death in that forest. Then he said he dug a shallow grave, buried her body in the ground, covered it, and walked away as if nothing had happened. After that morning, Valentina was simply expected in Perm. She had classes, she had a room in a dorm, she was supposed to return to her normal routine. When she did not arrive, everyone who knew her quickly realized this was not something ordinary. She was reported missing. The investigation that followed was intense. Authorities interviewed college professors, fellow students, and acquaintances, trying to track her route from Cheptsa to Perm. They searched for anyone who had seen her on the train, on the platforms, or in the city. Her father chose a different, deeply personal path. For several days in a row, he went to the same station, boarded the same train that his daughter had taken on September 30th, and walked through the carriages holding her photograph. He approached passengers, conductors, anyone who might have been there that morning, asking if they remembered her face, if they had seen her, if they could recall anything that might explain what happened between Cheptsa and Perm. Her mother, desperate for any help, contacted the acting Minister of Internal Affairs. Because of this, Valentina was placed on a federal wanted list, elevating her case from a local disappearance to a nationwide search. During the inquiry, investigators found several witnesses who said they had seen Valentina in the company of Sergey Khalmetov on September 30th. Police brought him in for questioning. He admitted he had traveled on the train with her, but he told them that at some point she moved to another carriage and that he never saw her again. There was no body, no murder weapon, no physical remains. Without a corpse and solid forensic evidence, the authorities lacked the legal basis to hold him. Khalmetov was released. He then did something that would later look chilling. He went to the Shklyeva home and told her parents face to face that he had nothing to do with their daughter's disappearance. It was not just a lie. It was an attempt to infiltrate their grief and redirect suspicion away from himself. For 9 long years, Valentina's case remained unresolved. Her parents lived between hope and despair, never getting a definitive answer about what had happened. The file existed, but no one was arrested and no body was found. Then, in February 2012, a new element appeared, a letter. It came from a girl who called herself Galina. She claimed that she and Valentina had been held in sexual slavery for several years and had eventually escaped together. She wrote that she was now living in the city of Pskov with her 3-year-old daughter, named Daria. For parents living in uncertainty, this letter must have sounded like a twisted kind of hope. If it were true, it would mean Valentina was alive somewhere, that she had survived, but was too traumatized or afraid to return. They gave the letter to investigators, hoping that it might open a new path in the case. Experts examined the letter and its origins. Their conclusion was harsh but clear. They determined that it had been written by a mentally ill fellow villager, not by an actual victim or witness. The lead was dismissed. Valentina remained officially listed as missing. Her parents returned to their long, exhausting wait, while the man who was later linked to her murder had moved on and would soon take other lives. The next known chapter of Khalmetov's violence unfolded in the summer of 2006 in the city of Perm. Two girls, one 13 and the other 12 years old, had run away from their homes. Like many runaways, they gravitated toward the railway station, Perm 2, a place full of strangers, noise, and movement. There, among crowds of passengers and trains, they encountered Sergey Khalmetov. He spoke with them and offered something that must have sounded comforting, a place to sleep for the night. They trusted him, or at least believed he was a safer option than the streets. Instead of taking them to a safe house, he led them to a deserted, abandoned building in the Dzerzhinsky city district of Perm. Inside that empty structure, away from witnesses and help, he threatened them with death. Under that threat, he raped both girls. After the sexual assaults, he strangled them, killing them both. Investigators who examined the bodies found traces of semen. From these biological samples, they isolated the DNA profile of the killer. It was a clear genetic fingerprint, but back then it did not match any known individual in the database. The profile remained attached to the case as unidentified perpetrator. The murders of the two runaway girls remained officially unsolved. Their killer continued to live, and his name was not yet linked to their file. The DNA profile waited in the system like a silent witness, ready to speak when the right name was entered into the database. The last known murder in this chain occurred around 2007 in the village of Balezino in Udmurtia. The victim was a 40-year-old woman who was pregnant at the time of her death. A few days after the crime, investigators received testimony from a witness that pointed them directly to Sergey Khalmetov. He was arrested and charged with rape and murder. Over the next months, police collected enough evidence to build a strong case against him. At trial, he did not try to deny everything. He admitted that he had killed the woman. His explanation was as cold as it was vague. He claimed he had killed her because of some kind of disagreement between them. The court found him guilty and sentenced him to 10 years in prison. During this sentence, Khalmetov behaved well in the eyes of the prison authorities. He was considered a good inmate, someone who followed rules, someone who did not cause obvious trouble behind bars. In the mid-2010s, officials took a blood sample from him, isolated his DNA, and entered his genetic profile into the federal database. After serving more than 8 years of his 10-year sentence, he was granted parole and released from prison on August 1, 2016. On that day, a convicted murderer walked out of prison, and the DNA database quietly gained the missing key that would soon unlock an unsolved double-child murder. Once out of prison, Khalmetov did not return to a stable family life. He divorced his wife. Without a home rooted in family and regular work, he drifted. He lived on the streets, surviving on occasional odd jobs and small temporary earnings. But while he was trying to rebuild some kind of existence on the margins, his DNA profile was active inside the system. The federal database now contained the genetic fingerprint taken from him in prison and the still unmatched DNA profile from the bodies of the two murdered girls in Perm. At this point, the double-child murder was still open, filed as a serious but unresolved crime. What the public did not see was that forensic technology, policy, and routine checks were moving toward a moment when the system would ask a simple question: does this unknown DNA match anyone we know? In mid-2017, that question was answered. The result would change everything for Sergey Baltabayevich Khalmetov, and finally, for the families of 2 murdered children and a missing student. In mid-2017, investigators turned again to the old, unsolved murders that were still haunting their files. Among them stood the summer 2006 case of the 2 runaway girls found raped and strangled in an abandoned house in Perm. The bodies had yielded a clear DNA profile, but for years that genetic fingerprint had matched nobody. Now, however, the database contained something new: the DNA of a man who had served time for killing a pregnant woman and walked out on parole in 2016. Sergey Baltabayevich Khalmetov. His genetic profile, taken from a blood sample in prison, was now sitting in the same federal system as the profile from the girls' bodies. When the comparison was run, the result was decisive. The unknown killer of the 2 girls was the same man who had once been a good inmate and had gone home early. The match exposed a connection the justice system had missed for years. The name behind the cold data belonged to a killer who had already proven he was capable of murder. Authorities placed Khalmetov on a wanted list. They tracked him down in Udmurtia, where he was drifting between odd jobs and living on the margins. He was no longer just a former convict. He was now the prime suspect in one of the region's most brutal child murders. When officers finally arrested him, the case against him no longer rested on rumors or appearances. It rested on his own DNA. Facing the brutal reality of what a conviction for the double child murder would mean, Khalmetov understood that his future now almost certainly led to a life sentence. That was when he tried to change the rules of the game and reached for the one bargaining chip he still had, the secret he had carried since 2002 about what really happened to Valentina Shklyeva. After his arrest, with the DNA match hanging over him like a verdict, Khalmetov tried to negotiate. He approached prosecutors with an offer. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he would confess to another crime: the long unsolved disappearance and murder of 18-year-old student Valentina Shklyeva. This was not a random claim. For investigators, Valentina's case was a scar that had never healed. A young woman had vanished after being seen with him. Her body had never been found, and her parents had been left without answers for years. Now the same man, already implicated by DNA in the deaths of 2 girls, was volunteering to close that chapter. Khalmetov wrote an affidavit, a formal written confession. In it, he laid out how he had traveled with Valentina on the morning of September 30th, 2002, how they had gotten off the train in Perm, gone to the Kuria station area, and walked into the forest. He described beating her, raping her, and strangling her, then burying her in a shallow grave and leaving her there. For investigators and prosecutors, this confession offered a chance to turn a missing person file into a solved homicide. But they needed more than words on paper. They needed to test his story against reality to see whether he could physically recapture the crime scene he described. That is why they organized a series of investigative experiments, bringing him back to the place where he claimed to have killed Valentina. In the fall of 2018, under heavy escort, Sergey Khalmetov was transported back to the area near the Kuria railway station. This was the same rough stretch of land he had described in his confession, a spot near the tracks, a patch of forest, a place where he claimed to have dug a shallow grave 16 years earlier. Investigators watched as he walked through the terrain. He showed them how he claimed to have led Valentina into the trees, where he attacked her, how he strangled her, and where he believed he had buried her body. Step by step, he retraced the actions he had written down in his affidavit. But time had not stood still. Over the years, the landscape had changed. A road now crossed part of the area where he said the grave had been. New structures had been built, altering the ground and covering the spots that might once have held a body. Even Khalmetov himself struggled to indicate a precise location. The forest did not match his memory in a way that would allow a clear excavation. Multiple attempts were made, but no remains were recovered. There was no body, no clothing, no visible trace of Valentina. The failure to find her remains created a major legal obstacle. Without a corpse and clear physical evidence, relying solely on his confession for a deal became extremely risky. In the end, prosecutors decided they could not uphold the agreement under those conditions. The plea bargain, which had been built around his willingness to help close the Shklyeva case, was canceled. The justice system turned its focus back to what could be proven beyond any doubt: the DNA-backed murders of the two girls in 2006. Once the deal collapsed, the case against Khalmetov for the double child murder moved forward toward trial. The evidence was strong. Forensic DNA tying him directly to the bodies of the two girls he had lured from Perm 2 station, raped, and strangled in an abandoned house. In court, that genetic link was the centerpiece. The young age of the victims, the brutality of the assault, and the cold efficiency of the killings painted the picture of a man who was not acting in rage, but in predatory control. There was no random stranger to blame, no vague figure in the background. The science pointed to one person. Khalmetov was convicted of the murders of the 12 and 13-year-old girls. The sentence was life imprisonment. He was sent to one of the harshest prisons in Russia, the Polar Owl Colony, located in the remote, frozen north, reserved for the most dangerous and irredeemable offenders. Inside Polar Owl, the days are repetitive and controlled. Inmates live locked into tiny spaces, surrounded by layers of concrete, bars, and ice. For most of them, there is no realistic hope of ever being free again. For Khalmetov, this meant that, in theory, society was finally safe from him. But while his physical freedom had been taken away, the story was not over. On paper, he was now a convicted child killer and a convicted murderer of a pregnant woman. Yet officially, the case of Valentina Shklyeva still had no murderer. Her parents still had no verdict that clearly named the man responsible for their daughter's disappearance. That unfinished chapter would pull him back out of Polar Owl and into the spotlight once again. More than 20 years after Valentina boarded her last train, investigators decided to reopen her case. For her parents, time had not healed anything. They still had no body to bury, no official ruling that acknowledged how and by whose hands she died. Reopening the file meant another chance to give them answers and to formally link a name to the crime. In 2024, authorities brought Sergey Khalmetov out of Polar Owl and transported him back to Perm. He was no longer the free man who had once visited Valentina's parents to deny everything. He was now a lifer in shackles, escorted by officers at every step. This time, investigators wanted more than his old words. They wanted to see how his actions matched his earlier confession. In the summer of 2024, they took him again to the area he had previously indicated near Kuria. To reconstruct the method of killing in precise detail, they used a mannequin, asking him to show exactly how he strangled the girl. He walked them through the sequence, how he supposedly approached, attacked, and choked Valentina until she stopped breathing. The experiment was recorded and analyzed carefully. Even without a body, the way he handled the mannequin, the details he recalled, and the consistency with his earlier affidavit became part of a new evidentiary mosaic. In the end, investigators concluded that his testimony and his reenactments were reliable enough to support a formal indictment for Valentina's murder, despite the absence of her remains. For the first time in more than 2 decades, her case was heading toward a courtroom with a named defendant and a structured accusation. Once the indictment had been filed and the path to trial was clear, something changed in Sergey Khalmetov's attitude. The man who had once been willing to confess for a softer sentence now seemed determined to erase his own words from the record. In his cell, he managed to hide a small sharpened metal plate, a makeshift blade that guards had failed to detect during a search. With this crude tool, he performed a precise, calculated act. He opened the case file and carefully cut out a specific section, pages 71 through 79. Those were the pages that contained his written confession and the full transcript of his interrogation about Valentina Shklyeva's murder. He folded the cut pages, tucked them into his A4 notebook, and brought them back to his cell. There, over the prison toilet in the floor, he burned them. Ash and fragments of his own confession were flushed away. To him, it might have felt like he was cutting his guilt out of reality, slicing his words out of history. The authorities, however, saw it for what it was, an attack on the justice system itself. They charged him with obstruction of justice, specifically with destroying crucial evidence in a murder case. Now, on top of murder and rape, his record would carry the mark of a man who tried to physically erase the proof of his own crimes. On September 16, 2024, the trial for the murder of Valentina Shklyeva began. For her family, it was a moment they had been waiting for since that morning in 2002 when she stepped onto the train and never came home. For Khalmetov, it was a last chance to try to twist the story to his advantage. In the courtroom, he no longer presented himself as a man seeking a deal. He now insisted that he was innocent of Valentina's murder. He admitted that he knew her, that they came from the same village, but he tried to recast who she was and what happened between them. At one point, he described her as a promiscuous alcoholic, claiming that she had willingly had sex with him. Her parents strongly rejected this portrayal. They knew their daughter, and the court heard from them what kind of person she truly was. Later, he changed his story again, saying that they had met a group of young people on the train and gotten off together at the Promyshlenny Uchastok platform. According to this version, he and Valentina went into the forest to have sex, and then he left her to return to the group, suggesting that someone else must have killed her. During these shifting stories, the emotional weight on Valentina's parents became unbearable. Her father fell ill after listening to Khalmetov's accusations and stopped attending the hearings. Her mother recalled a moment when she found herself in the courtroom before the judge and most officials had come in. She looked directly at him and begged for at least a single bone, some piece of her daughter's body to bury. She later said that he muttered something she could not fully hear, but she believed the meaning was that if he were found guilty, she would get nothing at all. Despite his denials and character attacks, the court examined the confession he had once given, the investigative experiments, witness statements, and the broader pattern of his crimes. On October 29, 2024, the court found him guilty of Valentina Shklyeva's murder. An additional 9 years were added to his existing life sentence. Even then, at sentencing, he refused to admit guilt for her case or for the double child murder, acknowledging only the killing of the pregnant woman in Balezino. He appealed the verdict, but the appeal was denied. The lead investigator later emphasized that even without a recovered body, the combination of evidence was strong enough to justify the conviction. Alongside the murder trial, another courtroom awaited him. In December 2024, a separate trial began, focused solely on the charge of obstruction of justice, the cutting and burning of pages 71 to 79 from the criminal case. In this trial, he admitted what he had done. He told the court that he had cut out the sheets containing his confession and the interrogation transcript, folded them into his notebook, and burned them in the toilet of his cell. He explained that he had used a small sharpened plate he kept hidden. At the end of January 2025, the court delivered a verdict. He was found guilty of destroying evidence in connection with the murder of Valentina Shklyeva and sentenced to 200 hours of forced labor. He responded by appealing again, calling the sentence absurd, given that he was already serving life imprisonment. The appellate court overturned the initial ruling and sent the case back for review. On March 27, 2025, after reconsideration, he was once more found guilty of all charges. This time, the court took his admission of guilt and claimed remorse into account as mitigating factors. His punishment was slightly reduced to 180 hours of forced labor. On a practical level, those hours of labor do not change his fate. He will remain behind bars for the rest of his life. On a symbolic level, that conviction matters. It confirms that even behind prison walls, even when he tried to slice evidence out of his file and burn it, the system still recorded and punished his attempt to erase the truth. Today, Sergey Baltabayevich Khalmetov is locked deep inside the polar owl colony, serving a life sentence with extra years added, and carrying a separate conviction for trying to destroy his own confession. He is officially recognized as a Russian serial killer and rapist responsible for at least 4 murders. The disappearance and death of 18-year-old student Valentina Shklyeva, the rape and murder of 2 runaways aged 12 and 13, and the killing of a 40-year-old pregnant woman in Balezino. His story shows how a man can move through life as a husband, father, and rail worker on the surface, while simultaneously hunting vulnerable victims on trains, at stations, and on lonely roads. It shows how a lack of a body can stall justice for years, and how a single DNA match can suddenly connect old crimes to a living suspect. It also shows how, even after conviction, he tried to cut out the record of his own guilt, literally slicing pages from his file and burning them. But in the end, what remains is not just his name on a cell door. It is a chain of verdicts, a trail of forensic evidence, and the enduring memories of the families whose daughters never came home. No matter how thick the concrete or how remote the colony, those facts keep him exactly where he belongs, buried in ice, sealed inside files, and remembered not as a good worker, but as a serial killer whose crimes finally caught up with him.